Today we'll take a look at 50 facts about the army of the Rebel Alliance in Star Wars. We look at different units, special forces, vehicles, tanks and more. As is often the case with the Rebels, we could actually include any technology, weapon or vehicle that existed at the time as the Rebel Alliance was formed from many different small rebel cells that simply used whatever they had at hand or could steal from the Empire. But today we'll focus on the things that are either commonly associated with the Rebels or that the Rebels might even be able to produce themselves at some point. At the beginning of the rebellion, the Rebel Alliance army could include almost anything. Old pro-republicans who wanted to take action against the Empire, deserting Imperials and even ordinary citizens who used everything they had to fight against the Empire. Over time, however, the Rebel Alliance formed and began to establish a more organized army, with different special forces designed for specific tasks or areas of operation, but also with larger sector armies that were responsible for holding certain areas in the galaxy or causing the greatest possible chaos for the Empire. And before we get to the larger vehicles and Rebel tanks, let's first take a look at the Rebel infantry. As mentioned, there were various special units. First, the Spec Force, and second, the Spec Ops. Spec Force were specialized elite soldiers who were often deployed on the front lines with larger armies. Spec Ops, on the other hand, worked in secret, usually behind enemy lines. Most of the time on missions that were relatively urgent and therefore had to be carried out unplanned and with a lot of improvisation. Spec Force, on the other hand, had significantly more planning, and we also have significantly more information about them. Spec Force was divided into 7 different regiments with 7 different specializations. In the first regiment, the Space Force Marines, the rebels were trained for combat on and in ships. They were there to defend ships from boarding by enemy troops and to board and capture important enemy targets themselves. For this, they received intensive training in most of the very few spacesuits available for the rebels, as well as information about which common ship components could be used to build weapons, traps and bombs. The Pathfinders, the 2nd Regiment, were intended for frontline operations. These specialists were deployed in small groups into enemy territory to conduct reconnaissance work for other Spec Force teams, or more often to secure landing zones for the main army, so that the army could be brought to the ground by the fleet. In the 3rd Regiment, the Urban Combat Specialist Regiment, the rebels were trained to operate in cities and large towns. They learned how to navigate these environments and, above all, how to use the narrow and often disorienting paths in such vast places to their own advantage. This included close combat techniques, but also strategies for gaining the local population over to their side and using them against the Empire. The exact opposite of these was the 4th Regiment, the Wilderness Fighters, also called the Rangers. They were dedicated to surviving and fighting in the absolute wilderness far from civilization. They were even able to use it for their own purposes. And here there were different specializations. Some companies trained for extreme cold, others for extreme dryness and heat, some for combat on and in water, and some for mountains. To be able to carry out these tasks, they were given the right equipment that enabled them to survive and maintain camouflage in such areas, but especially for units deployed on planets that were sparsely or even completely uninhabited. This also meant that they were allowed to have their own repulsor vehicles, so they could cover longer distances on their own. The 6th Regiment housed the Heavy Weapons Specialists. The name says it all. They were allowed to play with explosives, rocket launchers, artillery, and generally anything that made a big bang. And the 7th Regiment housed the Technicians. They were divided into various areas. Some specialized in vehicles or starfighters, driving or flying, others in scanners or droids. Among these, however, many also included the field of procurement. in this case mostly through unorthodox and immoral methods, but also the field of interrogation specialists. If you're paying close attention, you'll have noticed that I left out the 5th Regiment, for good reason, because they were the most secretive, but also the toughest of all of them, the infiltrators. They were used for missions behind enemy lines. But since these were not only dangerous jobs, but the infiltrators often had to work alone without the supervision of their superiors, only a few rebels were deemed worthy. Only the best of the best, those who also felt the greatest possible hatred for the Empire, were allowed to join the infiltrators. Those had lost families or perhaps even entire planets to the Empire, only to prevent corruption or torture and to ensure that infiltrators didn't spill the beans even if captured. And to ensure that the infiltrators were willing to carry out any task assigned to them by their superiors. The infiltrators' responsibilities could be very broad. They ranged from more traditional tasks, infiltrating Imperial circles as spies or sleeper agents, sneaking behind enemy lines and blowing things up, or even rescuing rebels from Imperial captivity. But missions could also include assassinations or kidnappings from high-ranking Imperials to wealthy families with influence in Imperial politics or business. This could quickly become very unpleasant. And in some missions, the infiltrators themselves didn't make it out alive until their explosives had completed the mission. The Alliance's Special Operations Groups also performed similar tasks to the infiltrators. However, they were under different superiors and often had considerably more leeway. While infiltrators were given individual targets to complete, usually in predetermined ways, Spec Ops teams had a much more free hand. Their task was then cause chaos on this planet, or if an Alliance intelligence team is having problems in this city, create a diversion. In return, they were given equipment, weapons, and often a limited number of vehicles, and that was it. From that moment on, these teams, usually consisting of a handful of people, were on their own, sometimes for weeks, sometimes for months or years, while they tried to cause the Empire as much of a headache as possible. The majority of the Alliance's armed forces, however, belonged to neither special unit. Most were deployed as infantry, perhaps as vehicle drivers, and equipped with the bare essentials, which usually just meant a blaster, maybe a thermal detonator here and there, a uniform, maybe a helmet if they were lucky. In most cases, especially in the early days, the Alliance just didn't have enough equipment for anything more. But speaking of vehicle drivers, what did the rebels have? When they weren't using captured AT-STs or speeder bikes from the Empire, the rebels did have several vehicles of their own at their disposal. Of course, mounting an E-Web gun on a speeder helped here and there, but the rebels could certainly do better. Among other things, the rebels had their own tanks, such as the T-1B repulsor tank, a 4-seater with a pilot, co-pilot and 2 gunners. It was equipped with 2 laser cannons and 3 anti-aircraft guns. Thus it had both anti-personnel and anti-aircraft capabilities. These tanks were manufactured by the U-Train Trakata company on the planet Eridus. The company actually built for the Empire. However, there were enough rebel sympathizers among their workforce that, by chance, tank deliveries occasionally fell victim to rebel raids. But the T-1B wasn't the only tank that U-Train Trakata sent to the rebels. The T-2B model also made it to the Alliance, albeit indirectly. This 9-meter-long tank could reach speeds of up to 200 km per hour, was armed with quad laser cannons and equipped with a shield generator, powerful enough to perform reconnaissance and anti-infantry roles, but nothing more. The just over 10-meter-long T-3B was considerably heavier. This time it wasn't mounted on repulsor lifts, but on tracks. and it was armed with 2 heavy blaster cannons and 3 proton torpedo launchers. This meant that the T-3B could also pose a threat to larger targets, such as starfighters, bunkers, AT-STs and even AT-ATs with those proton torpedo launchers. And the heaviest of this series was the T-4B tank. 10 meters long, capable of speeds up to 40 kilometers per hour, and armed with 2 heavy laser cannons and 3 assault missile launchers. It could destroy even the largest Imperial targets. Interestingly, all 4 of these tanks come from Star Wars video games. The odd-numbered T-1B and T-3B tanks from Star Wars Force Commander, which came out in the year 2000, and the even-numbered T-2B and T-4B tanks from Star Wars Empire at War, which came out in 2006. But Rebel vehicles could also be significantly larger, more powerful and heavier, like the Heavy Tracker. 22.2 meters long, capable of 130 kilometers per hour and armed with a heavy laser cannon. The interesting thing about the Heavy Tracker, however, was its sensor equipment. These vehicles were equipped with the latest technology. With it, they could scan the environment undetected and thus detect nearby enemies even without visual contact. Because heavy trackers were so large and sluggish, they were easy targets, which is why the rebels kept them relatively far behind their own lines. And of course, because a relatively large amount of well-trained personnel was required to operate them, which would also be lost if the vehicles were destroyed. The Rebel Combat Speeder, on the other hand, offered a mix of luxury and firepower. It was based on the V-19 Speeder design, and with it, the Sorosoup Corporation attempted to convert a fairly large speeder into a war machine. Surprisingly, it didn't go over so well. Luckily for the Rebel Alliance, since the Sullustan Sorosoup was already quite close to the rebels. These speeders fell into the hands of the rebels. And equipped with 2 heavy lasers, 2 missile launchers and a heavy blaster cannon, the rebels could definitely use these speeders quite effectively. The AAC-1 speeder tanks also came from Sorosoup, 5.6 meters long, armed with 2 laser cannons, 2 particle cannons and 2 missile launchers. But most importantly, 227 kilometers per hour fast and highly maneuverable. In terms of armament, they may not have been the most powerful tanks in the galaxy, but they were perfectly suited for the rebels' style of warfare. With the AAC-1, the rebels could do the same thing they did with their starfighters and small ships. Race in at top speed, quickly inflict as much damage as possible, and then disappear again before the Empire even knew what was happening. And how did the rebels get their hands on these AAC-1s? The design for these tanks had been completed by Sorosoup, but it wasn't particularly popular. And after one of the designers found himself immensely in debt to the rebels after Night of Sabak, he sent the designs over and the rebels even managed to set up a small production run themselves. To transport troops from point A to point B, the rebels also often used commercially available, partly civilian vehicles, such as the AA-5 speeder truck. At 21.4 meters long, it could carry approximately 25 tons of cargo with its repulsor lift engines, or 25 people. For the battlefield, these trucks were often given a bit more armor, and that was it. At 160 km per hour, they could transport various rebel units to their targets. Perhaps one of the rebels' best vehicles was the Freerunner, a 14.6 meter long repulsor lift vehicle capable of speeds of up to 300 km per hour. It was one of the fastest ground vehicles in the rebel arsenal. But that wasn't its only advantage. The other major advantage was its weapon systems. Freely rotating gun turrets on the outside that could be operated from the inside. This brought several advantages. First, it allowed targets to be aimed at in a variety of directions, while the crew remained protected inside. But most importantly, the vehicle was modular and relatively easy to modify. This meant that the rebels could equip free runners with anti-vehicle and anti-personnel laser cannons, or with 2 heavy anti-infantry laser guns, or 2 heavy anti-vehicle laser cannons, or potentially even with anti-aircraft guns. These free runners were produced by Kiliak Arms and Armor, originally for the Empire. However, since the Empire was already concentrating on combat walkers at the time, they no longer had any need for the free runners, so Kiliak frantically tried to make some money with them. This resulted in the free runner coming onto the open market and being sold to several larger dealers. Many of them, of course, were rebel agents who passed these repulsor vehicles onto their armies. This kept Kiliak afloat for a short time, but eventually, without further Imperial orders, they went bankrupt. The Alliance's Arrow 23 landspeeder was even more agile than the free runner. At 8.1 meters long, it could reach speeds of up to 400 kilometers per hour. These speeders were originally developed by Aratech for adventurers who wanted to explore alien and potentially dangerous planets. Accordingly, the speeder was fast, agile and relatively well armored. And by design, they were quite easy to modify. And while the official advertising for the speeder was aimed at adventurers, Aratech was aware that the speeders would probably also be used extensively by smugglers and bounty hunters who needed their own modifications, among other things to escape the authorities as quickly as possible. The Alliance took advantage of this, adding even more armor and equipping the speeders with a number of weapons, such as a laser cannon and a missile launcher, and using the speeders for their own purposes, both for fighting infantry and lightly armored vehicles, but also for transporting small units. The Arrow could also carry up to 5 people. This made Arrows perfect vehicles for special forces. Small units that usually didn't travel in larger numbers at once, that could modify their speeders for their purposes for each of their mission, and that potentially had to arrive and depart at great speeds. On larger battlefields, however, the Rebel Alliance could also boast even heavier vehicles, such as the MPTL, the Mobile Proton Torpedo Launcher, an 18-meter-long tracked vehicle armed with a massive proton torpedo launcher. It was perfect for inflicting damage on heavily armored enemies, even at long ranges. An improved variant, the MPTL-2A, was even longer at 27 meters, but was also equipped with even more proton torpedo launchers and could therefore naturally inflict even greater damage. Interestingly, these 2 artillery pieces also come from video games. While the first MPTL comes from Force Commander and also appeared in Galactic Battlegrounds, the second one is again from Empire at War. To be able to operate from the air, the rebels not only had their starfighters, but also something like the T-47 airspeeders. Originally intended by Incom as civilian speeders, they were heavily modified by the Alliance and equipped with weapons and systems. And to transport troops quickly, they also had the HTT-26 heavy troop transport. It could carry up to 16 passengers at a speed of 95 kilometers per hour. Subscribe if you want to see more 50 Facts videos about the Star Wars universe, and you can find the videos about the clones, battle droids and stormtroopers here in the end card.